Hello and welcome to the Energy Realities podcast. We have a full slate of people today. David Blackman is back from his mini vacation. Hey, David, how you doing?
Fine, just fine. I feel tanned, rested, and ready to go. Although I guess I'm just burned, not tan. But anyway.
That's excellent. I heard you had a great time and didn't get seasick, even though you circumvented a hurricane.
Yeah, we were kind of circling around Aaron the whole week last week in Bimini and a few other places, Dominican Republic, and had a lot of fun. It was just wonderful. But now I need to take 2 weeks to give my liver a rest before I'm full speed again.
Okay, we'll go easy. We'll go easy on you today. Hi, Irina. We have Irina Slav here today from Bulgaria. How are you doing?
I'm great. The weather's not as hot. Autumn is coming, and I'm happy.
Yay! Not so hot.
No.
And maybe the forest fires will be under control.
Yeah, it rains, so that should be all right.
Yay!
Yeah.
And we've got Stu Turley somewhere Are you in Texas or Oklahoma today?
I'm back in Oklahoma after being in Texas last week, so you gotta love it. I'm looking forward to not being on the backhoe this week.
Hey, I'm sure all that construction work helps keep you limber and focused on being able to think about what's happening over the news cycle, which is crazy these days.
Absolutely. That's why I have a welder, so I can try to put the stories together with a welder.
Awesome. And there's me, Tammy Nemeth. I'm in the UK today, and we have a very special guest. We have Mr. Paul Tice, who is a senior fellow at the National Center for Energy Analytics. He's also an adjunct professor at NYU Stern School of Business. He's a 40-year veteran of Wall Street and the author of this amazing book, The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. I think almost all of us have one. And so today, Paul's here to talk to us about his super innovative proposals in his recent report, A Strategy for Financing the Nuclear Future. Hi, Paul. Welcome to the program.
Morning, guys. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
So, Paul, just to kind of start out, can you give us a real quick executive summary of your paper and what you're proposing here?
Sure. So there's obviously been, over the last year, I would say, even towards the tail end of the Biden administration, more public support for nuclear, which is good. We have issues in the grid, obviously, in terms of reliability, and we've pushed a lot of wind and solar, which are intermittent, into many of the regional grids, including ERCOT, including up here in PGM, where I live in New Jersey. And eventually that's going to lead to problems when demand is now going to be growing 1% to 2%. It was fine over the last 10 to 20 years when electricity demand in the US was basically flatlining, right? But in a growing environment, clearly renewables don't work, right? And so we have to get back to dispatchable sources of power. And nuclear, which has been dormant for decades, needs to be part of that discussion. So there has been more public support for nuclear, but that mainly is about SMRs, which are small and modular reactors. We haven't built any of those, right? So that's still kind of a science experiment to see if it works at scale and it's economic. And then there's also a movement to restart some of these mothballed nuclear power plants with PPAs from mainly the tech industry. But no one is actually talking about restarting large-scale nuclear reactor construction. And so what's the obstacle to that? And as we go through in the paper, I think the problem is the financial risk is just too extreme with regard to building a large nuclear reactor. And by that, I define it as greater than 1 gigawatt reactor. The perception is that it's too financially risky. And the sponsors traditionally of nuclear reactor construction are electric utilities in this country, right? So if they're afraid to undertake it now, we need to understand why. And as we propose, we think it's time that we find a new class of sponsors who are better skilled to handle all of the financial and development risk at the front end of a nuclear reactor's life, and then probably turn it over to a utility to operate it for the next 75 years. Utilities are very good at keeping the lights on and operating nuclear plants. They're really bad if you go back over the last 60 years at building them on time and on budget.
That's awesome, and an awesome summary. And I'm wondering, Stu, if you could bring up slide 7, which shows that one. So on this chart, for the people who are just listening, it's figure 4 in Paul's report, where it shows this graph of the U.S. nuclear power capacity additions and retirements from 1969 to 2024. And there's like this huge gap between probably around 1995 till about 2013 or so, where nothing was built. And so there was like this huge influx of nuclear power plants being built. Then there's nothing. And now we're seeing retirements, and there's only been a few built since 2013. So Paul, why is there that gap there, that sort of drought of nuclear power plants?
Yeah, I think nuclear as an industry is unique in that you have not seen the normal development of any industry where they get better over time. They learn from the process. There's a normal learning process, which should lead to economies of scale and lower cost over time and quicker delivery. We've never seen that with the commercial nuclear space, mainly because of regulation, I would argue. I think the NRC has been, safety concerned to a fault over the years. And with every operating incident anywhere in the world, it has led to an overreaction in terms of their regulations and their approval process. So if you go back to the heyday of the industry, which was the 70s, it started in the 60s, into the 70s, and then the 80s, we had 3 Mile Island in 1979, when I was a senior in high school, long time ago. And you can see the overreaction by the NRC. So, there's another chart here we can talk about in a few more minutes. But, in the 70s, the track record was pretty good for the industry about completing nuclear reactors. And these weren't small reactors. They were close to 1 gigawatt in average size. And the average cost of completing them pre-3 Mile Island was less than $2,000 per kilowatt. And the average time was 6 years, right?
Yeah.
Post 3 Mile Island, the time to complete them doubled, mainly because of regulatory reviews, and the cost more than doubled. They went to $7,600 per kilowatt. And those are inflation adjusted 2024 dollars, right? So something happened. So clearly, I think regulation has been the main problem, and that persists to this day. But after the 1980s, when we completed the last batch of reactors that were in the pipeline, and a lot of them were canceled right after 3 Mile Island. So we would have had much more capacity now if we didn't have that shock that occurred in the late 70s. And that was also obviously followed by Chernobyl in 86, which again, extrapolating out from a nuclear incident in the Soviet Union really has no relevance to the US. But that's been the norm over the years, and any nuclear excuse to basically go negative on the industry, the environmentalists clearly have been there, as well as the regulators who should at a certain level be supporting the domestic industry. And in Fukushima in 2011, you saw that same reaction. And that led to actually, countries, including Germany, opting to shut down nuclear reactors. So a very extreme response to what was basically a tsunami-related incident, right? So I think regulation is something that the Trump administration is addressing, and they need to really work on that in order to kind of break some of these other ancillary logjams that we have. But, the industry went dormant, starting in the 90s. We had an attempt under Bush the Younger at a renaissance, right? They passed the Energy Policy Act in 2005. There were 31 orders for new reactors, large reactors. 20 years later, we only built 2 of them, right? Again, Fukushima happened after that last attempt at a renaissance. And then we also found out that the NRC was still a problem, right? because even though they attempted to streamline the process by coming up with a combined operating and construction license, thinking that would make it easier, that actually made the change order process more rigid, and so it delayed it more. So, the two units that were just completed in the last 2 years, right? So, 20 years they were originally planned back in the 2000s, and we just completed the only two new generation reactors down in Georgia in 23 and 24, right? And those came in at the highest cost ever on an inflation-adjusted basis. So that sticker shock, I think, is playing through a lot of people's minds within the industry. Certainly the people that hate nuclear are using it to their advantage to say it's cost prohibitive to build nuclear in this country, even though it's being done in other developed countries at a much more efficient rate. So I think we need to analyze exactly what's gone wrong. Regulation would be a big start. And then also, I think, the sticker shock from Vogtle is something we have to really get behind, because I don't think we're going to get electric utilities to step up at this point. And in the paper, we go through all the issues around why.
Paul, this is an outstanding paper, by the way, and I don't mean to be nice to you on a Monday morning, but holy smokes, Batman, look at this bad dog. This chart is comparative nuclear construction cost by country. And when for our podcast listeners, you take a look at what you were just talking about, the Vogtle plant at 15,972 per kilowatt, and you take a look at South Korea, India, and China, and they're all in the $3,000 to $3,000 range. Holy smokes, Batman! You take a look at the UAE, which I came in, I believe, around the $5,000 range. I have to go fact check that one, but France is at 5,000. They have roughly, I believe, 50 some odd reactors, but they're only capable of running at about 50% because of their maintenance issues. They stripped out their maintenance over the past several years. Look at the United Kingdom. They're right up there with the U.S. Way to go, United Kingdom. Follow the United States. Woo! Holy smokes. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, I think the UK has the same problems that the US has in terms of government regulation. I think there's probably more antipathy towards nuclear over in Europe. I think that's fair. Tammy and Arena can tell me if I'm wrong there, but the countries that have lowered the cost and the completion time are those that haven't had an arrested development of the industry. The government has been very supportive. Korea would be a good example. China, obviously, because the entire economy is government related. So when you have government support, including financial support, and you don't have government regulators getting in the way, it tends to lead to better execution. And with any large infrastructure construction project, time is money. So if you double the completion time, it's going to effectively double your financing cost, right? And that'll be embedded in the final cost. And you saw that with Vogtle, right? It was originally both those reactors, which were AP1000, the Westinghouse design, and we're arguing that we need to build more of that specific reactor design because we've already built it. We've learned from Vogtle, if we're willing to acknowledge the lessons there, and we need to build what we know, right? We can't spend any more time de-risking other reactor designs, whether large or small, because we're just going to lose time there, right?
Yeah.
So,
Paul, we have a couple of really good questions from viewers here. One from Tom Butts. With the inflation impacts, do we know how much a new nuke would cost? I guess in the U.S. is what he's asking about. What's the average cost today, do we think?
well, just extrapolating out from Vogtle, if you want to go back to, this is levelized cost here, but if you go back, all right, so go forward. The orange chart, which Stu was focused on with the comparative.
Keep going. Not that one.
No.
Which
It's the one where you had the UK and the US at
Oh.
about the same level. Where is that one?
Coming up next.
Right.
Yeah,
That one.
right. So this is basically using inflation adjusted prices for all of the numbers shown here, right? So the orange is Vogel, the original budget, how the actual number that came in for both, and then a pro forma which would X out all of the non-recurring factors that elevated the price of Vogel, and we should go through all of the things that were non-recurring around the Vogel project,
Yeah.
which shouldn't come into play down the road. And then these are reported from other countries. We think the data is fairly reliable, but again, when you're dealing with a country like China, for example, you have to take every number that they report economically or construction-wise with a grain of salt. But the delivery times are tougher to fudge, right?
Right.
So they're clearly they're seeing better execution. So I think these are achievable numbers in the current inflation environment, right? I mean, there are bottlenecks that we have to basically restart the industry and build it up again, because it's been more than a year since we completed the last unit at Vogel, and we don't want to have that little expertise that we started to build out, going overseas, because there are more AP1000s being built overseas than in the U.S. We have no orders right now, which highlights kind of the problem that we have in terms of everyone's afraid to build one of these. So I do think the numbers that we have in the paper, which just came out 2 weeks ago, are achievable, with some wiggle room, right? You should be able to build a new reactor at an overnight capital cost, not including financing, somewhere in the range of $6,000 per kilowatt. And then if you embed on financing, and we think a project financing cost would still be cost effective, that gets you probably to $7,500 to $8,000 per kilowatt. I think anything under $10,000 per kilowatt, utilities would be fine with that.
Yeah.
I think the regulators who would have to approve the purchase of that brand new nuclear reactor at that price would be okay with it. Again, it would be half of what we just spent on Vogel. And certainly you can justify those economics if you look at a reactor that has an 80-year operating life that basically has a 95% capacity factor.
Right.
Right.
And then the other one from Patrick Devine, where the dearth of nuclear plants since 3 Mile Island, is there a silver lining being the shift in a national load centers beginning to shift more west than east could mean nukes being built more where needed now than in the past? And I guess the other point of that is when you get to the Midwest and Texas and, not the West Coast, but in between the two coasts, you're looking at friendlier regulatory environments now as well, probably, at least at the state level. So do you foresee a shift, a kind of a regional shift in nuclear development in the future?
Well, I mean, most of the population is not in the plains area of the country.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a fair point. So I think we need to put, and that may be one reason why we're not seeing a lot of data centers being put in Kansas or the plains.
Right. Right.
Intuitively, I think that's true. Virginia is very concentrated with data centers. We have them up here in New Jersey. A lot of those are related to the financial industry over the Hudson in New York. So they may follow the load from these data centers, but I would argue that we shouldn't have dedicated, reliable energy, nuclear or otherwise, just for the tech sector. I mean, we can't have a bifurcated grid where our data needs are 24/7 satisfied, and then the rest of us have consumers as well as other industry have to depend on a grid that has way too many renewables in it and has the risk of outages, kind of in Mad Max fashion, right? So we have to have, I think all the nuclear that we build should be used to firm up the existing grid, right? And I think it's a good sign that some of the tech companies like Microsoft, as well as Meta, when they've signed the PPA to restart a couple of these nuclear plants, it's not a direct PPA. So they're helping to restart it with their purchase agreement, but that power will go to firm the grid.
Yeah.
And they can claim whatever crazy, zero emissions credit they want to with regard to their carbon profile. Whatever gets us to the right place, I'm fine. And I do think that we should see more support from from the environmentalists and the climate activists for nuclear, right? I mean, hands
Should.
down, it's dispatchable, zero emissions energy. So it beats wind and solar, any day of the week. And, if we could just dispel this rumor that it's not cost effective and it's prohibitively expensive, which I think is easy to do, then we should see, others from the left joining on board. And I think the fact that the tech companies, which clearly skew liberal in terms of their management, them being on board with nuclear, I think will help. I think build some momentum there.
I just had a couple interesting interviews with CEO of a nuclear company, as well as the interview with the folks that are really working with the Stargate data center. And I think modular reactors are going to help delineate nuclear into the big power plants, which I think we need. And I love your phrasing of having the big nuclear plants stabilize the grid. But what I'm seeing, Paul, is that we're seeing behind the meter is becoming very critical for businesses in the United States. And either you pay for your own power and you pay for your own behind the meter services. Modular reactors, several of them are planning on building 100 reactors the size of a truck, every a year. So I think that is going to be the way around the regulatory issue and get that cost per kilowatt hour down, will be the modular reactors. I don't know how people are going to stomach paying for the big boys again, even though I think that that's something that needs to be an export as a service. I believe the U.S. has 2 Westinghouse orders potentially going into Poland. I need to go check that. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, no, there are orders overseas for the AP1000. Poland, Bulgaria would be one. There are obviously 4 operating in China. I think they also have an order book there to add more units. So, but none here. Westinghouse has announced over the summer, I think it was back in July, that they would like to build 10 AP1000s here, but they have no, order book for those 10. Right.
Right.
I think it's a good sign, and obviously, their business would benefit from a reestablished U.S. industry, especially since Trump has put out this stretch goal of quadrupling our generation capacity for nuclear over 25 years. I mean, we're not going to get there, but the fact that we're going to shoot for it, I think, is a very good thing. So, and if we're going to, come close at all, we're going to have to really get started on that. But I'm fine. Again, all of the above is fine as an energy policy with an asterisk. I think when it comes to the grid, it should be only dispatchable power, right? We need to stop coming up with a different standard for renewables. But with nuclear, if SMRs are the approach for certain industries, smaller reactors, I would be agnostic about that. I think that's perfectly fair. I have a natural gas generator here because I don't trust New Jersey's transmission grid, right? A strong wind on a sunny day and my power is out for 4 days, right? So I just, don't want to have to deal with the food going bad all the time, right? So I think SMRs would be in that category. But Stu, again, we haven't built any of these things. We've just approved, I think, 10 new designs. NuScale's been talking for years. Oh, just wait, we're going to build something. And until you actually build it, it's just like a large nuclear reactor. You don't know what the economics will be. And, I think the jury's still out about whether it's going to be a savings from a kilowatt.
Nanonuclear reactor founded by JU, and I just interviewed James Walker, the CEO, and they have 2 locations already approved, one in Canada, one in the United States. And their design is going to be for also ships as well as small modular nuclear for small cities and those kind of locations where they could drop them into coal plants, and start going into data centers that way. They have their approval process working with Chris right now. And as they get them approved, they're also getting they're building not only the two new nuclear sites that they're the test sites, they're also building their factory at the same time. So for me, that was it was absolutely huge to hear that they're building their factory at the same time so they can get mass production of these things.
Well, I think Paul's point is, I think he's accurate there. I think we have to draw a distinction between the hype and commercialization. So there's a
Exactly.
lot of hype right now where, like he said, there's these 10 ideas, and Stu, your guys sound really interesting that they're building this factory at the same time. But until you actually have it commercialized, like the big ones are already commercialized, how long does that take? And it's one thing to say, okay, we did this in a lab, we got this great pilot project going, but it's a big leap from pilot to commercialization.
Yeah.
And who knows how long that's going to take. And I think, Paul, I think your point is that we don't really have all that time. We already have this design that works. We've worked out the bugs. Why do we want to set this aside? Why don't we build more of this now that we've kind of worked out the problems?
Yeah, and I think the other problem you have is that everyone's got their own SMR design. And one of the faults of the industry over the last 50 to 60 years is that we have way too many reactor designs and, bells and whistles. We have, right now, there are 94 operating nuclear power plants. At the peak, there were more than 100. We have 50 different commercial designs, right? So we've taken this diversification goal, which I think is important when you're talking about a strategic asset like nuclear power. And we've taken it to an extreme. I think we're doing that now with SMRs because we're approving more than a dozen probably, and everyone's going to be slightly different. And our ability to replicate that, even though, Stu, they're building a factory, which is good, that's showing a commitment. But, once they build the first couple of units, then we'll know if there are problems with some of these modular components. With Vogel, they found out that they fabricated a lot of the components in a factory. And then once they had it on site, they realized there were problems. Their ability to rework those components was hindered by the fact that it had been done off site, right? So that actually added to the delay. I'm not sure if they would be of the same scale problem that you have with SMRs, but it'll be a learning experience. And I think that will delay the process and it could elevate the cost. And the other thing too, I made this point to Tammy the other day. Everyone loves SMRs and you don't see the environmentalists really pushing back on it. But wait until we start actually building some of these things. And then we'll see if they actually are okay having more nuclear assets, even though they're smaller, spread out further across the country. I'm sure the backlash is coming there. But I think right now people are just waiting to see if actually you build any of these.
Paul, one of the big questions I have is talking to all the data center and AI guys that I've been talking to. I've had a few people that I've got even in the pipeline here. Meta is constructing their 10 billion, 4 million square foot artificial AI data center, Holly Ridge. It's going to be natural gas. And your point of natural gas is on point. You can get them and stage them in here. I love the way your thought process was on this paper, and that is we've got to get the finances fixed on these big boys. But I'm afraid the data centers are going to be hogs. They're going to be self-serving hogs, and I think that at Meta is going to be one of them because they're just dropping this into Louisiana. And like New Jersey and back east, you're seeing an inflation happening because of data centers of higher electricity prices caused by the demand of the AI data center.
I think that's overstated, don't you? I mean, the electricity costs in the Northeast have been skyrocketing for 20 years now. And there's a lot of different causes to that.
They've really skyrocketed, David, in the last few months, like in New Jersey.
But
In,
yeah, I
in
understand.
New Jersey, they went from $600 to $1,000.
Right, but
And-
offshore winds played a big role in that, and there's a
Let's
lot
take
of
New
factors.
Jersey. New Jersey has nuclear and natural gas. Why are their prices going up? It's because of the transmission costs.
Well, but they also have offshore wind, where they have promised exorbitant. They've made commitments to exorbitant rates for those offshore wind farms under this governor. Anyway, I'm sorry, I don't want to derail the conversation.
No. You've set me off, so I need to jump in on this. So, and I've written about it recently, but in New Jersey, my utility just raised my rates and everybody else in the state by 17 to 20% in June. And that is attributable to both problems here under Murphy within the state and our participation in PJM, which for the last 10 to 12 years has gone from being one of the better run RTOs to one of the worst run RTOs,
Yeah.
right? But here, as you say, if you care about emissions, we have almost an optimal mix of generation right now because it's nuclear and natural gas, right? And our natural gas is right next door in Pennsylvania. So, hey, call me crazy. Let's build more pipelines over to Pennsylvania. We can do that, right? New York is shutting down their pipelines. Murphy has been shutting down pipelines that cross across New Jersey as well, right? And he's wasted all this money on offshore wind, which has nothing to prove for it right now. All of those projects have been canceled. And Ørsted took $1 billion of federal money that Murphy re-gifted out to them to keep them in their last project, which should have gone to subsidized ratepayers in the state, right? So right now we're dependent on PJM because we can't supply all of our generation needs because we shut down the last of our coal and we stopped building natural gas years ago, basically when Murphy came into power. And nuclear, like everything else in the country, has been in this, condition of stasis where no one's been adding capacity up until, the recent talk.
Yeah.
So, we need to, I think New Jersey would be great to participate in the nuclear build out. We should build more natural gas. And I've argued we should probably get out of PGM because they have the same problem on steroids that we have in New Jersey because it's a collection of more than a dozen blue states in the Northeast. Oh, maybe we're just going to compound all of our climate policies together. And you've seen that with PJM. They have a capacity market. What have they been let bid into it? Wind and solar, most of which has been fictitious. The interconnects and the transmission requirements have delayed all of it. And they've allowed fossil fuels to be shut down over the same period of time. So committed capacity in PJM has dropped sharply. And now we finally get the price reaction, right? Up 17 to 20% is not a normal, well-functioning market. So
Nope.
Pray for New Jersey this November when we have our governor's election.
Paul sounds like I sound when I talk about ERCOT.
Irina, I want to bring you into this. What was the reaction in Bulgaria amongst the people when they approved nuclear power, like this Westinghouse one, which was signed, I think, just like a month ago?
Did they?
even-
We're in polite company, so I won't quote, but the price tag is much higher than it would have been if it had, if they had continued with the original plans, because they have to take everything down, and Westinghouse's prices are just much higher. And we're not happy about it because, we, normal people, regular people, because we're going to have to pay for it. And it's a purely political decision. It's not an economic decision, which is what most decisions of our latest dozen governments have been, which is why we don't really like this. But we can't do anything about it. I don't know. Are they going to start construction anytime soon? Because it could take years.
Yeah.
And it probably will. We don't know if this government will, live through a full term of 4 years. And who knows what the next government will be like and what will happen then. So I would understand if Westinghouse is in no rush to start work on this project.
Is the current government liberal or
Oh
conservative?
yeah, it's very pro-Western. We don't do liberal and conservative here. We do pro-Western and anti-Western.
Okay.
So the last the last few governments, none of which lived to term, have been all very, very pro-Western, but they haven't really been able to do anything with long-term implications because they get overthrown in just a few months. This one might, I think it might survive a year or a couple of years. We'll see how things go next year when we adopt the euro, because people are unlikely to be happy about this. So this may make such large-scale projects more problematic, even more problematic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're not going to break ground on this, then there's probably a risk that you could easily cancel it. So,
Yeah, I think the European Union should pay for it because they made us close 4 of our 6 reactors, and the 2 that they graciously allowed us to keep using are producing a lot of electricity. They're like keeping the lights on in most of the country.
so they made you, even though.
Oh yeah, it was a condition for joining the European Union. There were 2 old, there were 2 Russian. The 2 functioning ones are also Russian, but they're perfectly fine. So they made us close them on safety grounds.
Yeah.
There were no safety problems. I actually have a friend who works in an industry adjacent to the nuclear power plant, and I asked her, was there a chance to restart at least a couple of the ones we shut down? She said that it's not possible because they're being shut down too long ago. So we are forced to build new reactors if we want more nuclear power. But at least we don't have Germany's problem with the environmentalist lobby and the anti-nuclear madmen and mad women. I don't understand this. Yeah. So at least that's that. That's good news. So whoever ends up building new reactors, there will be no such massive opposition from the population, which is good news, I think.
Right. No.
It certainly is.
A two-front war is worse, right?
Joanna had a good question, I think. If AI doesn't provide its own electricity, doesn't it mean we, the ratepayer, will be paying disproportionately more for the power and transmission?
Yeah, I mean, more load in general is going to stress the overall grid. So unless you have some of these AI users having their own dedicated power, it's going to stress it. And I think policymakers need to take that into consideration, right? They can't just, again, like in PJM, just allowing any capacity, real or not, to be bid in. They can't just allow any, million-foot data center that's going to gobble up power like a small city, if not a large city, to just come online. There has to be a gating function, I think, to that. Otherwise, everyone's going to pay for it. I agree with that. So that's another argument that if you want to push some of them to get their own dedicated power and keep it separate from the grid in order to minimize the cost to average ratepayers, I think that should be part of the policy. But there's a lot going on. We have to shore up the existing grid, right? Because we've been asleep at the switch for at least 10 years now. Really, at every state that has a renewable portfolio standard. I mean, it's been 20 years that we've been pushing these dumb things. Even West Virginia pushed it and didn't realize it until 2015, after their coal industry was dead. They finally got rid of their RPS, right? So every state has it, some to an extreme, and hopefully with what Trump and the DOE are doing now, with the endangerment finding and dismantling a lot of the federal climate bureaucracy, the next step will be to push down through all the states, right? Get rid of all of these, zero emissions targets or climate goals, right? And a lot of them have fed into the electricity grid. But we can't have a bifurcated grid. I agree with that. And the goal of policymakers has to be to minimize the average cost over time of electricity. And I think that's having a diversified mix of coal, nuclear, and natural gas, right? And we shouldn't just all do natural gas because, it's the thing we can build more quickly right now, because down the road, we're going to have to deal with higher natural gas prices potentially, which will
Yeah.
drive the cost of electricity because we're going to be exporting a lot more LNG, right? And our market is going to be more tied to the international market, and gas overseas is tied to oil prices. So we're going to import a lot of that volatility. We can't go all gas, right? Nuclear clearly is attractive. You know, it's only 8% of our capacity, and it's almost 20% of our actual generation. So it has punched above its weight for years. We need to remember that. And I think we should start building coal plants again. I mean, if you really want to call out, you know, the whole climate argument, build another coal plant, right? That is also good baseload power. And then again, we've got 3 different streams, and that over time should minimize our exposure to supply chain issues and feedstock costs. So,
Yeah, those are all really great points. And I want to kind of tie it back to the whole financing thing, because one of the criticisms of the Vogtle plants and why the cost was so out of control, you make a really good point in your paper, in your report, that, you know, if there had been this other financing mechanism, it would have reduced the cost, because the way you describe it is Westinghouse, which had never constructed nuclear power plants before, said, yeah, we can do this. We can be the contractor and we can be the designer, and we're going to do this all in one ourselves. But you're proposing that private equity with dedicated infrastructure companies that have experience building large projects would be able to bring that cost down. Can you explain that probably a little bit better than I just did?
sure. So, but let me expand on some of the points about Vogtle, because that is central to the whole argument that we can build nuclear large reactors, you know, on time and on budget. We just need to look past everything that was unique around Vogtle. So it was the first time construction of the AP1000, first next generation design, first reactor we built in an actual generation in this country, right? First time we built something going through the new NRC process with a combined construction and operating license, right? So it was a learning experience for everyone, including the people at Georgia Power, which sponsored the project. You know, it's not the same people that built Unit 1 and 2 at Vogtle, right? Those people have, you know, long since retired. And so it was a first of its kind from a number of perspectives. But as you mentioned, one of the big things that we're not going to have to worry about going forward is the fact that the EPC contractor for Vogtle was Westinghouse. So they designed the reactor. I mean, they've designed most of the reactors in the world that are in operation right now. So they're very good at nuclear reactor design. But as you said, they have never built a reactor, right? And so, you know, anyone who's done a home construction project know you don't want it to be a learning experience for your contractor, right? When he's working on something. And you had that with Westinghouse, and they actually compounded the problem because they were building the 2 reactors at Vogtle in Georgia, and simultaneously they were building 2 same-size reactors in South Carolina for the South Carolina utilities. So you had 4 1.1 gigawatt reactors they were building simultaneously. Okay, you know, and the regulators, the company sponsors in Georgia as well as South Carolina, no one raised their hand and said maybe this is a problem. So I think the due diligence was pretty poor all the way around, right? And not surprisingly, we had a surprise delay at the front end of the process because the NRC changed its rules, right? They approved the AP1000 back in 2005. In 2009, when these 4 reactor projects were going to FID, the NRC came out and said, we need to change the plans because we have to make sure the nuclear reactor can withstand a commercial hit from an airliner, right? All right, so that delayed us 3 more years, right? And then we kind of basically started in 2013. And what was found is that the change order process was very rigid. There were almost 200 amendments for each of the Vogtle units because they had constructability problems. They had modular issues where they couldn't fix some of the fabricated units on site, so they had to ship them back. Again, it's all learning because this is the first time one of these things was ever built. And then, not surprisingly, with all of the delays that were built into it and the fact that they went to FID without detailed engineering plans, which you never do, the cost just escalated, and Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy, right? So, and their contracts were very rigid, so they had to eat a lot of the change orders, and so it's not surprising that they filed. So anytime you have a contractor file in the middle of a construction project, you know it's going to be painful, right? And so that delayed it further. It doubled the time from 5 years, which was the original plan, to 10 to 12 years, right?
Wow.
The cost went from, as I said, it was close to $8,000 per kilowatt. When the dust finally settled, it was $6,000 per kilowatt. So, and then also we had COVID at the back end, right? So I think we can assume we're never going to have another COVID situation. So you bake all that into it and explains away a lot of the cost overruns and delays around Vogtle and why we shouldn't have to deal with that going forward. But the sticker shock is there. What's interesting, we at the National Center for Energy Analytics, we do an annual energy conference down in Washington. It's called the Energy Future Forum, and we sponsor it with Real Clear Energy. And this past year, we did it with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we had the head of Georgia Power speak on one of the panels, or get interviewed, really. It was more of a fireside chat. And she was talking about nuclear and Vogtle, obviously. And at the end, the moderator asked her the question. They said, any plans to build any more nuclear reactors in this country? And she just shook her head and said, no. And I think that just speaks to the problem we have, because clearly Georgia Power knows the best about how you build these things and what went wrong and what to do right going forward. And they know that Unit 4 came in better than Unit 3 in terms of cost. And we started to see the beginning of an efficiency and learning process going from one unit to the other. And still Georgia Power has no plans, right? So I think with electric utilities, their track record is so poor. You have the Vogtle headline still fresh in everyone's mind. And I think the people who run electric utilities are fairly risk averse, right? So you're taking career risk if you get this thing wrong, right? Yeah. And we saw that with the South Carolina project. Again, that one was canceled, that Westinghouse was building. So $9 billion of capital was sunk into the ground there. SCANA, one of the sponsors there, they were so weakened by that they were forced to sell to Dominion, right? The head of the other utility had to step down, right? Some of their executives went to jail, right, for misleading regulators. I think a lot of that was scapegoating. But even Georgia Power didn't come out unscathed, right? They were downgraded. Their bond ratings were downgraded because of the financial stress. They were forced to sell their Florida utility to raise money to shore up the balance sheet. And so I don't think any, executive who's at the tail end of their career, who's doing an actuarial estimate is going to want to take that risk. So as you mentioned, we're proposing a project financing, and project finance has always been a way to mitigate risk, right? So if you have a large capital project, do it off balance sheet. Don't risk the company, right? Which is what was done with Vogtle, right? Georgia Power and Southern obviously were a stronger utility to start with, and they were able to weather even $35 billion total cost for those two reactors, right? But most utilities are not in the same position as Southern, I would argue. So project financing allows you to move all of that risk, construction risk and financing risk, off the balance sheet, do it on an asset-specific basis, but we need to bring in a better manager for the construction period. And we think that infrastructure private equity fund managers have all the skills that would allow them to succeed in nuclear construction and still achieve their targeted returns. So it's all about making money. The fact that, Wall Street and private equity investors have never done anything in nuclear is because it's been very unattractive because of the open-ended construction risk, right? You will kill your economics during the construction phase if you get it wrong. You can never make that back, right? So nuclear has been unique in that respect. But when you think about it, it's not too different from building LNG liquefaction terminals, right? Or plants, right? There's a lot of capital commitment there. There's a lot of asset-specific binary risk. So I think a lot of that skill set is transferable. And project financing lets you raise a lot of cheap debt. So that will allow you to put smaller equity checks into every project which will help you minimize your risk as a fund manager. And we need the government to help out in terms of providing that debt option, which they're already doing for renewables. So we're arguing just repurpose a lot of that money, which obviously will no longer be going towards subsidies for other technologies. So we do think it can work, but I think the White House really needs to make the pitch. And this morning, the piece I wrote in the Washington Post kind of goes through that whole argument that Trump really needs to get out there and make the pitch to Wall Street about nuclear as an attractive investment, right? The economics can work. We go through that in the piece, that you can still create these nuclear reactors at an attractive value for a utility buyer while still making, north of 20% returns, right? So we just need to get execution, and we need to have a proof of concept. So another reason why, we need to get a bunch of these projects going, and then I think it'll feed on itself. The private markets will step in and solve problems that it's given, right? So if you can prove that the first couple work, right? And the other important point about Vogtle, we have final blueprints from Vogtle, right? They've all been approved by the regulators. So assuming we can build that without making any more meaningful change orders for the next AP1000s, the execution, we should not be surprised by anything on the regulatory side. And back to your question before, I think it was David, about where do we build these? I would gravitate towards existing sites, right? We have nuclear plants. There are 21 in this country. The DOE came out with a report back in June, which identified nuclear and coal sites that actually would have room for an AP1000, right?
Yeah.
So we've got 21 nuclear sites. Most of them are obviously skewed towards the east, because that's where most of our nuclear capacity currently sits. If you want to do a pure greenfield, that's fine. Definitely we should do something in Texas, because I agree with your issues around ERCOT. But coal, also, we've mothballed a lot, and those are connected to transmission. And I think the number is 80. We've got 84 coal sites that could handle an AP1000, right? So I think something else, but we would definitely want to fast track it. What the Trump administration can do, besides providing cheaper loans to the DOE, is fast track the approval and siting process.
What do you think about the Trump approach of fast tracking the ability for developers to build plants on federal lands at federal property around the country? Some of that's not going to work, right? Because it's not going to be connected to enough transmission to make it go. But I mean, we have locations in Texas in major population centers. There are 5 Army bases in San Antonio, for example, 5 military bases in San Antonio, Texas, where you could theoretically do that. But is that an effective approach, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things about dispatchable power is it's concentrated, and, the footprint is small.
Yeah.
Because it is such efficient energy. So I think we need to locate it, near where the load is, but also where the transmission infrastructure is, because you want to minimize the delays all through the chain.
Right.
I do think your point, David, around SMRs and putting them on federal land or Army bases, that will eventually trigger a backlash from somebody when they realize we're going to have these mini nukes, right next door. So I'm sure locating those closer to population centers, will lead to some delay.
Right.
I would bank on it. So I think we should, again, the industry kind of hit this hiatus back in the late 80s. There were plans to build, Unit 3 and Unit 4 at Vogtle, back then, right? And it's the same for a lot of other nuclear sites right now, which only have 2 units, right?
Comanche Peak in Texas is one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
But the problem is we need the regulators at the state level to also push it. Just like they've pushed renewables on us for the last 20 years, we need to get a concerted push to hopefully get the ball rolling. So I think the federal outreach also has to go to some of the state levels, and maybe, Georgia, South Carolina would be good candidates to build it. I mean, I would say red states, but, even blue states. We can't forget our fellow citizens who unfortunately located in blue states.
They sometimes forget themselves is the problem, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, and you've had happy noise made by New York State and some others about nuclear.
And even Gavin Newsom in California, is kind of moderated a little bit on the existing sites there, right? Allowing them to, or the one that's still operable, to continue, extended the life of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a much different discussion about building a new nuke in California.
Yeah.
And I think in New York with Hochul, I think she's just been honestly playing Trump, because she got the Empire Wind Project restarted, and now she's saying, oh, well, maybe we'll talk about natural gas, and then she's commissioned a study on nuclear. All right, so that's basically going to delay it years down the road. It'll make it seem like she's doing something, but we're not building any natural gas pipelines here. And the New York State laws are kicking in at the end of this year, where new construction can't have natural gas in it, right? For private homes. And so electricity prices, as you said, they've been high in New York for a while, and will continue to go up. And now you're going to force people building new houses to basically, heat and cook with much more expensive electricity.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
which will increase demand.
Yep.
Right. And, again, if we're going to electrify the economy, then we shouldn't be dependent on intermittent renewables, right, for our generation, right? So none of this makes any sense at the end of the day. And then when you point out that renewables are raising the cost of electricity, the response you get back is, no, that's not true. And then you have these contorted arguments about why, because, one of the states in the Midwest has very low cost, but nobody lives there. That apparently proves that everything you see with your eyes and your ears is not true, right? And you see it in Europe too, Tammy Arena, right? I mean, every time you bring up that Germany has high electricity costs because of their bad electricity policies, it's like, no, it's all because of natural gas, right? So the solution to that is just get rid of fossil fuels, and then prices will go down. And, right?
Yeah, that's what we hear in the UK every day, which is hilarious.
You're just blaming the victim, right?
Yeah,
basically.
So I'm wondering, Paul, would this be a case of the private equity and infrastructure companies having a project and then trying to sell it to the utilities to say, look, we think you have an issue here. We'd like to do this. Will you support it? Or is it a matter of the utilities approaching the private equity and infrastructure companies to build these plants that they know that they need the power? How will that work?
I think it can be both. I mean, I think it could be an idea that germinates hopefully within the electric utility industry, and they could be there as the buyer, right? I mean, that will help any construction commitment by a sponsor, right? If you know that the buyer is going to be there at X price, right? And so I just need to make sure I can execute and preserve my margin and still sell it at that price. So that will be helpful. But I think, there's nothing preventing Wall Street from basically, developing this concept and then shopping around their utilities. Or, I think the logical thing would be to sell the reactor once it's completed, right? But there's nothing that says that you can't, right? Because a lot of these private equity funds who are active in infrastructure, they have fund structures that are evergreen, right? Because, they realize that a 10-year private equity fund term probably doesn't work when you're investing in assets that are 75 to 100 years operating life. So rather than forcing the fund manager to sell at a point in time for an artificial reason and maybe leave money on the table, a lot of the incumbent managers, like Blackstone or GIP or Macquarie, they have developed these evergreen structures so they can continue to hold it. So there's nothing that's saying that after you build it, these sponsors couldn't also continue to hold it and then potentially sell it down the road. So they would have that optionality. But I think it's a logical thing to have both of those potential tracks, right? So they have that flexibility. But obviously, there are a lot of counterparties that need to be involved in all these discussions, which is why I think the White House needs to kind of coordinate kind of the process and maybe kick it off.
Okay. Well, I think we're running up to our hour stopping point here. So
it
Paul,
just flew by.
It flew by. Oh my
It
gosh,
did.
so many comments. Thank you to everybody who commented or had a
Great
question. Paul, thank you so much for your time and talking to us about your really innovative proposal for how we can get big nuclear back on the grid.
Thanks, guys. This was fun.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely week.